Hey, it's 11:02, so I think we're gonna get started. So thanks everybody for joining us for another DevCast. I am Ali Hockaborn, a member of the developer support team here at Genesys. Today we're gonna have Anthony Alford talk to you about API monitoring using APIs. Um, Anthony is the lead software engineer here at Genesys as well, and Um, just to let you guys know, if you need to rewatch the webinar, it will be hosted on our YouTube channel, which I'm sending out links to once the webinar is uploaded. There will be a 10-minute Q&A if you have any questions for Anthony at the end, or you can ask questions in the Q&A section in the Zoom webinar. So without further ado, Anthony, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just one sec. Gotta get my mouse. Okay, hey, yes, as Ali said, I'm Anthony Alford. I'm a lead software engineer. I'm on the platform API usage team, and we provide the infrastructure for the feature that I'm discussing today. What we're going to talk about are using APIs to analyze API usage. It's very meta. As software developers, we love being meta. This feature is useful for org administrators and also for platform developers, app developers who want insight into how their organizations or how their apps are being used. We're going to be at a very low level of difficulty. I'm going to show a demo using the Genesys Cloud UI and a couple of demos using the Developer Center API Explorer. We do have some documentation. There's a resource center, a help page article about using the view in our UI, and then you can get the documentation on the APIs themselves from the Developer Center. Okay, just some numbers. Everybody loves numbers. Genesys Cloud, as you know, everything goes through our API. If you're using the UI, if you're using an app, the mobile app, anything goes through our API, and we get over, these numbers keep going up, so it's hard to make a slide, but we have billions and billions every week. We have over 150,000 users, and we're in 9 different AWS regions, so we've got a lot of activity overall. But for your own org, how many API requests do you have? And how many API requests, if you're an app developer, how many API requests is your app making? We're going to see how you can answer these questions. So every API request, we log a lot of metadata about that. We log the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, how. We don't know why. That's up to you. But we log who made the call, the user ID. We log the what, the URL and HTTP method that was used for the request. We log when it happened, the timestamp, and we log how the request was made, meaning the OAuth client. And because an OAuth client can be shared amongst organizations, we log the organization ID that the client is defined in. So here on the right side of the slide, you see an example, some fake data that looks like what we are logging. So this was a request to get the list of queues for the org. That's where you see HTTP method was get, and the template URI was this one to get the list of queues. It returned to 200, so it was successful. And then I've made up fake values for everything else, but that gives you the idea of what those look like. Now, we don't give you that raw data, but we let you make aggregate queries about that data for your own particular org or OAuth client. And that'll let you get some insight into activity patterns. So we can let you make queries that get the overall number of requests made. You can also count them by response code. So the 200s or 201, 202, those are all, everything is grouped into a bucket of 200, 300, 400, or 500. So you can see if the request succeeded or failed. Obviously the 400 ones are going to be so-called client-side errors. versus the 500s, which are server-side or our fault errors. You can also slice and dice these aggregates by the who, what, when, and how. You do need a permission to make these API calls. You need the OAuth client view permission because it's really kind of oriented around the OAuth client. So let's talk about the construction of one of these queries. So if you think back to that metadata that I listed, you know, the who, what, when, where, how. What you can do is you can query for a time range. So aggregate all of the request metadata in a time range. So the start and end range. I think the maximum total range is like a month, maybe, more or less. You don't want to go too big because otherwise the query is going to not perform well. But you can put it at any point in time. Then we take all that request metadata and we kind of group it by the time dimension. And so we group them into buckets of the size of a day or a week or a month. You can specify that. So if you wanted to analyze requests activity by day, or if you wanted to look at it overall over a week or even for a month. Then you specify the dimensions you want to slice or group that data by. So we let you group it by OAuth client if you have multiple ones. You can group it by org ID if you're looking at it as a developer, looking at the different orgs that are using your app. You can group it by the what, right? The URI request method or template URI. And you can you do it by user ID, although it's not recommended because that's probably not going to perform very well in terms of the query. And then finally, we let you specify what numeric data you want to look at. And it's really just the number of requests overall or sorted or separated out by response code. This 429 is a special one. That's ones that are rate limited. So that would be especially useful if you're looking at an app or something that's getting rate limited a lot. You can see which requests are happening and getting those rate limits. There are two types of query you can do. So the first one is for a single org. All right, this queries for a single org across all the non-built-in OAuth clients, so all the custom OAuth clients. This is for an org admin to see which apps are being used in their org. And it's especially useful if you're getting billed for going over our fair use rate of API usage. And this one we actually have a view in the UI that is built on these APIs, and we'll see a quick demo of that. The other way to query this is for a given OAuth client. Now this would be something where you're an app developer and you can see queries across all the orgs in the regions to see which API calls are being used, or being made by this client. This is great if you're a developer and you want to see the adoption and actually especially the efficiency of your app. You can see if the app is making the API requests that you expect it to make, the expected number of calls. So let's actually look at a demo of the UI. So I'm going to share a separate screen. Here we go. Okay, so here I'm in the Genesys Cloud UI. I'm going to show you a view that we've built for org administrators to view the usage of API usage in their org. So we have a menu here under performance. There's one called API usage. So what this does is this makes a query that I mentioned. It gives you can choose the time range here. It takes a second to load up. So I'm going to actually do it for last week. So this is going to show me the usage in my org last week. And so that's going to be June 21st through the 27th. And this is where we have dead air waiting for queries to, okay. So what do we have here? So this bar, this chart right here shows kind of like a bar chart for each day. the 21st, it was so minuscule, it's not even showing up. So on the 22nd, there were 2,087 total requests. On the 23rd, 708, 589, and then 516. Okay, so this is the total requests broken out by day. Now we also have it here broken out by OAuth client. So this org has 4 different clients that are being used to make calls. Really, bet you can't guess which one is mine. So I'm going to look at this one. This will just do a quick filter. So this shows me that this is for the whole week, this data on the right here, API requests. This shows me that I'm making 6 different making requests to 6 different API endpoints. Mostly, you know, and we get the total number of requests here. And so we can kind of see how my activity is distributed across different API endpoints. It's pretty basic, but it's nice if you, again, if you want to see what sort of activity is being done by custom integrations or apps in your org, and especially if you are getting billed for going over our fair usage. Okay, that's our UI. Of course, sorry, was somebody saying something? No. Okay, so you can do some preset date ranges, and you can group by, let's see, let's do, well, these take a while to run. You can group them by day or week or month. So let's do month by week, just to show you what that looks like. So that kind of coalesces the data to a less granular time distribution, right? So I can see I've got a big chunk of activity in this week, but not a whole lot in the other weeks. Okay, let's actually do some API calls ourselves using the Developer Center. So I'm going to, hopefully everyone is familiar with this. Sorry, I need to pull up my notes here. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Developer Center. I'm going to click on API Explorer. And what you can do is you can search for usage, and you'll see this show up here. So this query is actually the same API that this is making, that this view is using. So there's a 2-step process to this. First, you make a query. And so I've got to build a query here. And remember those pieces I went over: the interval, the granularity, the group by, and the metrics. So I'm just going to plop down my pre-built query here. Okay, so the interval is, I'm going to go on June the 21st. Let's just make it midnight to midnight. And then I'm going to go to the 28th. And I'm going to go like that. Okay. I'm going to group it by day, and I want back the OAuth client, the HTTP method, and the template URI. And I'm actually going to get requests. I'm going to get status 200, and I'm going to get status 400. So what this will show me is this will show me the overall number of requests that I make on each API endpoint. And it will also tell me how many of them were successful and how many of them failed. Maybe like with a 404, I'm trying to get a resource that doesn't exist, or 403, where I'm trying to access a resource I'm not permitted to. So we'll do that. Now, what do I get back here? I get back essentially a thing telling me to go poll this URL for results. So what you would, if you were building some code to do this, you would kick off this query, and then you would check this endpoint here to see if it's done. But this is actually right here, so I'm going to do this. I'm sending the request. Okay, it's done. Very nice. It's complete, and you can see I'm getting data back. So here's essentially the data that I've got in the UI, but kind of broken out like this. So you can see, let's just say this was on June the 23rd for this API flows. Let me go back to this so you can kind of just see last week, of course. June the 23rd. I needed some jokes to fill in the dead air here. All right, it's not the same number. I wonder if it's because this is off by 1. All right. Okay, ignore that. But basically, you see that all my requests are coming back the same number in the 200, so those are successful. I've got the endpoint and that the request URL I'm making. So there we go. Okay, well that's for an org. So I did a query within the org. Now let's say I'm using this OAuth client to create an app, and I'm sharing that client ID with other organizations. So I'm going to copy that client ID, and I'm going to go here. I'm going to do the same thing, only I'm going to query. I've given it that client ID, and I'm going to make the same query here. So what I'm going to see, and I actually want to do organization ID. So what this is going to do is this is going to show me the different organizations that are using my client. And it's going to let me see what requests are being made and whether they're succeeding or failing. So let's do this. Let's do week, just for kicks. So I'm going to make that request. I get the execution ID, and I'm going to go back here, and it's done. So let's look at a couple things. So let's look. This is one organization ID, 82A93, and here's another one. So I'm making this. Tells me right away that this client is being used by 2 different organization IDs. And notice this one, I'm making calls and I'm getting 400, 4x, some sort of error response. It turns out these are 403s because the user that's making this call, the user that's using this app, is not actually permitted to hit this endpoint. So I can see, this tells me maybe that the org that's using this has misconfigured something. They need to give the users some permission in their roles. So this lets me kind of help diagnose some problems. So that's pretty much my demo. Let me go back to my slide deck. Share this again. Where'd it go? There it is. Okay. All right. So we did that. So we did a query for a client ID, so it queries across all the orgs, and we can see how it's being used by other orgs. So just a couple of notes. I already did this. When you make a query, you don't get the results back right away. You get an execution ID and a results URI. So you do a get on that results URI, and that will return a response. The response has a query status that is either complete or running. If it's running, ask again later. If it's complete, you'll have a JSON array of results. So a couple of weird things about this. The time interval, you saw I kind of had a problem with that. The problem is, like, time interval is very, very coarse. So you really cannot get any finer query than a day. And in fact, it's not really a day, it's a 24-hour time range that's from midnight to midnight in UTC. So for us in the Eastern US time zone, it's from 8 p.m. to 8 p.m. the next day. So you can get some weird results when you're trying to look at it on a day level. It's probably really better to look at it for a week. So the other thing about the response JSON, I'll go back and show you this. If it gives you all it gives you entries for all the dimensions and metrics. If you don't request those by either putting them in the group by or the metrics, they just won't be populated. The numbers will be 0 and the dimensions will be blank. And if you don't specify a group by, you get it grouped by OAuth client by default. And I mentioned earlier, but we'll just kind of emphasize this, and you could see it in the UI. For the organization level query, the first thing we showed, the thing that has a UI page, we don't give you data about the built-in OAuth clients. So that's the Genesys clients, Genesys Cloud Mobile Client, our embedded client, our web UI. We just don't give you that results. This is more for, developer type stuff, third parties or integrations that are not provided by Genesys. Let's quickly look at those again. So you'll notice, this is going to be slow. When I said with the JSON response, we get everything, right? We get client ID and name and org ID and user ID, et cetera. We get a value for every one of these status types, but they're not populated if I didn't request them. So I didn't request status 500 or status 300. If there were some, they wouldn't show up, right? So that's important to remember. And don't be misled by the fact that there's a 0 there. It's just because we defined the response to look like this, it's going to have these fields. They just won't be populated. And so you can, you'll see here, you probably notice there were only just like 4 clients here. One of them was my demo, and another couple of random ones. We're just not showing the, Genesys Cloud. Obviously, people doing stuff in this UI, we're logging those requests, but you can't query them. So, Allie, that is all my content. So, if we are ready to do questions now, we can go start with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anthony. I don't see anyone having any questions, but let's see. Does anybody have any questions? Let's see if I can. Yeah, if you want to actually ask your question by talking, since we have a smaller audience today, I can enable you to talk. Does anybody have any questions about the monitoring API usage?
I think I went kind of fast, I'm afraid.
What?
I'm afraid it might have gone kind of fast. I tend to do that.
I thought it was a good pace.
All right.
Let's see. We'll just give it a minute here. Otherwise, we will end a little bit early. Okay. So
there's one. Here's one. Oh, no, it's pretty clear. Okay.
it was pretty good. Hey, that was good feedback, though.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. I guess if you guys don't have any questions, we'll be posting this on the community YouTube page, which you'll receive a link for after the webinar. I didn't want to end too early, but it looks like the feedback is that it was pretty clear. So,
and well, there's not a lot there, right? It's just basically two different types of queries. It is very powerful, and so be creative.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks guys for attending this DevCast. We will have another one next month. We are now doing DevCasts in 3 different languages, in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. So keep an eye out. And thank you so much, Anthony, for taking the time to do this with us.
You're welcome.
And do you have any closing words?
No.
Oh.
No, but sorry.
Oh,
the question.
How do we have to manage the 429 error? How do they manage? Oh.
Okay. So for the 429, you've been rate limited, and that just means you need to make those requests less frequently. I'm not sure the exact number, but you essentially every I think basically your OAuth client per user gets so many requests per minute. And so if you get 429, you just need to wait. And so what can happen, like a scenario, maybe if you're doing this with an app, maybe you have a loop, a for loop or a while loop that's pinging, checking something. What you might do if you built something to check these results the query results, just slow down. And so Sudipta says, is it on licenses? How much requests the customer can send for each API? I think, Becky, maybe, I don't know the number offhand, but we do have like a fair use limit. Is that right?
We do have a fair use policy that applies to all of our public-facing APIs. So the kinds of APIs that Anthony demoed as being queryable with this service. It depends on the number of licensed users and what kind of license you have. So an organization with 5,000 Genesys Cloud 3 licenses will receive a larger allotment than an organization with a single user with a Genesys Cloud 1 license. I can, if you'll just bear with me for 1 second, I can put a link in here in the Q&A to our fair use policy explanation.
Those were good questions.
We have another one. All right.
Hey,
What's a good way, Ali, if people have follow-up questions, what's a good way? Is it developer forum a good way to ask those?
yeah, the developer forum. Becky, were you going to say something?
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah, the developer forum is the perfect place to ask any of these kinds of questions, whether it's about using the usage APIs to query your API usage. I just said 2 words multiple times. Or whether you have questions about your fair usage allocation or about rate limiting, any questions that you have about using our APIs, we welcome your questions in the developer forum. You typically will get a response within the same day. So we do encourage you to ask your questions there.
Yeah, and if you guys have any suggestions on DevCast that you want to see in the future, feel free to post that in the dev forum as well. I just went and grabbed the link. I'm just going to paste it in the chat really quick. Let's see here. So all attendees. So here's a link to the developer forum if you need to ask any further questions. It's in the chat for Zoom, but you can also find it on the developer portal towards the bottom. There's a link to the forum. So you guys want to call it a day?
Definitely.
Any other questions?
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Ali. Thanks, all
Thanks,
of
everybody.
Oh, Amy raised her hand, but
Go ahead.
okay. I think. Let's see, Amy. I'll see if she's still here.
All right.
Let's see. We might have lost her. Okay. Well, hopefully she asked the question in the forum. All right, guys. Have a great rest of the day.
See ya.